All right, so let's talk about video switcher. So first thing to know for this guy is in terms of communicating, you're gonna have the same headset we have on our cameras. So it's just this one-eared guy. When your arm is up, you're muted. When it's down, you're talking. And again, that can go on either ear. So whatever's more comfortable for you with that. And then looking at the switcher itself, obviously tons and tons and tons of buttons, but all you really need to use on a Sunday is stuff in this bottom row, and it's not even everything in the bottom row. So just kind of walking through what we typically use. So over here, these two identical rows, your top row is your program and your bottom row is your preview. So especially since we have so many cameras on a Sunday, you're basically setting up your preview and then you're going to transition your shot onto the program. So you don't really want to be live cutting up here, because then if you happen to hit the wrong thing, it is up there already and you can't take it back. So it's best to preview your shot, make sure it's the right one, and then you can transition it. So just working our way across, we have all our cameras 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then these last 3 are what's coming from the computer. So you don't really have to worry about putting these up at all. It's just, since these are inputs in the switcher, they're here also, but you don't even really have to worry about these last 3, just the first 5. And then this next button is shift. So these can all have like secondary things, but I haven't set anything up on those. So you don't have to worry about that. Yep, it's just there. And then next we have our 2 transitions. So cut, just cuts between your shots. So here, make this a little clearer. And honestly, if I have a preference, I would say just use cut all the time. I mean, watching the way other people live stream and movies and stuff, cuts are used when you're in the same place. In movies, they'll use fades and transitions when they're like changing scenes, but we're not changing scenes. We're just in a service. So cuts work great. They might seem like they feel abrupt, but at this point, everybody is seeing them constantly in anything they watch. You can just kind of work past it mentally and it'll be okay. It's not going to stand out too much to anybody. But if you did want to use a dissolve transition, you can just use this auto button and it will fade between the 2. So we have it set up so that it is automatically on dissolve, or in this one it's called mix. So that's what all these up here are all the transitions, but we don't use them because they look cheesy and weird. And it's kind of one of those, like, just because it can do it doesn't mean we should do it. So just keep it simple, stick with mix, and it just crossfades the 2 shots and keeps it nice and simple and clean. So again, you can either just cut, or if you do want a little bit of a fade, you can use those. This slider is basically a T-bar that you see on most normal switchers, but you don't need to just use the button. There's not a reason to go slower than that. It's just gonna look like a weird, like, 80s school picture with like a head floating and someone smaller up close. But just in case you did need to know, you can transition with this guy as well. And then next we have our downstream keys. So we're not using our second one. You'll notice no lights on, but we are using this first one. So this is our alpha key. It's how we get our lower thirds and how all of that works. So if for some reason you're not seeing the lower thirds on the program feed, you can check and see if this light's on. Again, it never gets touched, so there shouldn't be a reason it's off, but just in case, it's something to check, potential troubleshooting problem. And then last we have our fade to black, which just fades to black, and then you can fade back out of black. Again, we don't really use that ever because we don't have just nothing on the screen during our live stream, so you don't really have to worry about it. But again, just in case you need to know, it's there. So like I said, we're pretty much just using this bottom row, but so you know what stuff is, that's for transitions. This is your downstream key. And then the only other thing you might have to mess with are these buttons right above. So you'll notice we're on macro. These are basically choose different things for whatever these buttons do. But we're gonna hang out on macro all the time. If the power goes out, it'll default back to this key cut 1, but otherwise it'll be on macro. And I only have 2 macros set up, and all these macros are doing is controlling what is going to the center screen. So 1 is our normal iMag with lower thirds. It's getting exactly what the program is sending out. Number 2 is what we use during worship, so that we can have a background and words and not have the iMag on the screen, which just gives us a little more flexibility with camera angles. So 1 is kind of the default iMag, 2 is to have backgrounds on the screen during worship. So those are the only things you really need to know. I might even label them. We'll see. But yeah, so that's all the important things. The only other thing that could be weird is you do want to make sure this background is on right here, because that's kind of what you're transitioning with the cuts and auto and that stuff. But again, that never gets touched. It defaults to that. Unless you press it for some reason, it should be right there all the time. And yeah, like I said, there's more buttons and stuff. I don't necessarily know exactly what they all do, because a lot of this stuff I control from the software instead of on the actual switcher. I'll just keep saying it. You can pretty much just hang out in this bottom section and not have to worry about too much. You're just setting up your program, make sure it looks good, and cutting to it. And that's all you really have to worry about. That and communicating. So let's talk about communicating a little bit. So the other half of this position is communicating with your camera people and making sure you're helping them stay in focus and making sure their shots look okay. You're kind of like the last set of defenses before it goes out to the stream. So it's good to kind of keep in mind how things look, and don't be afraid to say something if something needs said. But there's also right ways to say things and wrong ways to say things. So don't chastise people and say, oh, that looks terrible, get me something else. Just say, hey, let's try a different angle, or we need a little more headroom on that. Hey, he's getting out of frame a little bit. Can you follow him? That kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, kind of think about how you'd want to be talked to. And if you talk to people that way, it shouldn't be too big a deal. But the other important thing is making sure you're clearly communicating which cameras you're going to and who's live. So the way I usually do this is whichever camera I want, I'll pull up in the preview. And let's say we're going to camera 4. So I'll say camera 4 ready, and then I'll transition and I'll say camera 4 is live, or you can say take 4, cut 4, dissolve 4, whatever you're doing. As long as you're being really clear about that and saying when you actually go live with that camera, it just makes the operators' lives a lot easier. So I definitely suggest that. Something you want to keep in mind is when you are talking with your headset, you want to make sure it's basically like as close to your mouth as you can get it. I know it might seem obtrusive, but this just helps people hear. If it gets farther away, the new wireless system we're using isn't as loud as our other one. So the closer you get to your mouth, the better. Just don't like use a lot of P's, I guess. No, that's what this is for. So they're kind of made to be as close as you can so you don't have to talk as loud. But if your camera operators are saying they're having trouble hearing you, you can talk a little louder. I know like this window's open, so it feels pretty exposed. But do what you have to do to communicate. But also be aware, like don't just be, all right, camera 2 ready, and camera 2's live, and then camera 4 will come to you next, ready, 4 is live, okay, and 1 ready, 1 is like, don't do that, obviously, but don't feel like you have to whisper either. There's kind of a healthy balance, especially when worship is happening. There's plenty of noise in the room, so you're not going to distract people too much. And again, like I said, you're kind of that last line of defense before stuff goes out to the stream. So it's kind of good to know what kind of shots you want to look for. So in general, for wide shots, they're great for establishing shots and kind of letting people know what the room looks like. But we don't want to hang on them too often or like default to those just in case somebody moves. I know it's a little easier that way, but especially, well, there's a couple reasons. So for our live stream, we don't know what devices people are watching on. So if they're watching on their phone and it's a wide shot of the stage, then like people's faces are a couple pixels. So a big part of worship is kind of that connection, and a lot of worship leading is engaging with people. And if they can't really see your facial expression and that kind of stuff, it kind of takes away from that. So we want to make sure that we're communicate what's happening on stage as best we can, and creatively if we can, with different camera angles and pans and zooms and that kind of stuff. So again, wide shots are okay, just don't hang on them and make them the default. What I suggest during worship is if you have a camera that's keeping whoever is leading the song in frame, it can be just that person, or it can be like a 2 or 3 shot, as long as it still has that person that's leading in it. Then you can always have that shot to jump to, and they can kind of move between stuff as they need to for that. But that way, no matter what, you at least have the person who's leading the song. So even if they're not necessarily singing right at that part, they're still engaging and worshiping. That's during worship. During the sermon, kind of a similar thing. We don't want to hang out too wide because, again, Dee Dee and Aaron and David and whoever's speaking are doing a lot of communicating with their faces, not just their voice. And during the sermon, we also have our IMAG. So if we're on a wide shot for our IMAG, the IMAG is image magnification, and it's not really magnified if we're on a wide shot. He's the same size as he is in the room or smaller. So we kind of want closer shots of that. My recommended shots for sermon are if you do a waist-up shot, and that's kind of your closer one. That still gives him some room to gesture around and not have his hands going out of frame the whole time. And then you can do a little wider shot. I like it kind of knees up, the top of the knee up, and that gives a little more space. It's enough of a differentiation from the waist up that there's some interest when it changes, but it's not too far out that you can't really engage as much with the face. I know kind of the default for a lot of people is full body shot, and then you kind of work your way in. But just based off of what we've done and kind of what Dee Dee likes, he's actually pretty particular. He just doesn't communicate it when he's on stage. So I get to hear about it during the week if there's stuff he didn't like. So yeah, knees up and then waist up shot typically works out great for the sermon. Another thing you want to pay attention to is the headroom. So obviously you have a bigger screen than what your camera operators have. So if you notice that top of the head's touching the top of the screen, just have them tilt up a little bit. Just say, hey, need a little more headroom. So for the sermon with our 2 shots, that one is kind of a knees up and one is kind of a waist up. If you try to match the headroom, then it still feels weird. What I found / learned is if you kind of get the eyes about the same level between your 2 shots, let's say Dee Dee's eyes are like up here for the knees up shot, but then they're like kind of down here for the waist up shot. Even if the top of the head is lined up, that still makes it feel like, oh, he's shorter in one shot and taller in the other shot. Even though it's obviously he's the same height all the time. So if you match the eyes, it's kind of, if you think of it as that's what people are looking at, if you keep that kind of consistent between the 2, obviously keeping in mind your headroom too, it's a balance of the 2 things. But if you try to get the eyes pretty close to each other, it feels pretty natural to transition between the 2 shots a lot of the time. And during worship, obviously we have a lot more camera angles to work with during worship. We have 5 cameras versus the 2 or 3 we have during the sermon. So you can kind of use those to your advantage. You can also kind of think of building your cuts and your activity as the song builds up. So in bigger parts of the song, when they're like kind of really going for it and it's louder and everybody's just strumming out or playing out, you can do more switches to kind of match that energy. So you can kind of like start the song hanging out on whoever's leading, maybe go to an instrumentalist when they're doing that, and just do your shots a little slower. But as the song builds up, you can have more going on. That just kind of helps match the energy. Again, it's kind of that creative part of this, and kind of the fun part. It can be intimidating at first, and you can work your way up there. It's fine if you're not there right away, but it's kind of the fun part. Yeah, that's just some basic guidelines. Obviously, it's a little tricky trying to do something for both people online and people in the room because they're kind of serving different purposes, but we're also kind of trying to fulfill the same general purpose of helping people see what's happening on stage and communicating that to people as best we can. So yeah, that's just some general guidelines and stuff. Again, make sure you're communicating with your operators clearly so they know who's live, when they're going live, that kind of stuff. and you're the last line before it goes out. So make sure it looks real good. Thanks.